Uh, Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, silence, please. Yeah, we shall carry on with our work. So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alexander Martinenko. I'm a senior partner with CMS Cameron McKenna at the Kyiv office. I will be the moderator of the second panel of this day today. And the second panel is a sort of like a continuation of the previous one, but we will address most of the issues and some of them that have not been touched upon yet, and from slightly different perspective. It's called Boosting Economic Recovery through Effective Reforms. And today we have a truly exemplary panel. With us, Francis, we would not let him go from the scene. Yeah, so Francis will carry on speaking here. Jason Pellmar. Jason is the head of International Finance Corporation Regional Office in Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. Satu, Kahkonen. I hope. Close enough. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Country Director for Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine World Bank. Tanaka-san. Masaru Tanaka. He's the advisor of Minister of Finance of Ukraine, expert. Are you a former or a current employee of Central Bank of Japan? You're still with the Central Bank of Japan?
No.
No longer, but
retired.
Formerly retired. Formerly with the Central Bank of Japan. We had to have also Mr. Tymofiy Mylovanov, the Deputy Chairman of the Council of the National Bank of Ukraine and the founder and honorary president of the Kyiv School of Economics with us. However, he's on his way. He perhaps will not be able to catch up with this particular panel, but he will join discussion at a later panel. And what we're going to talk about, we're still talking about one and the same thing, about reforms. However, all of us were conscious that reforms should not be implemented for the sake of reforms. It not be something that should be prosecuted for itself. It should have a certain goal. Yeah, and in our our view and in our discussion, the goal of all these reforms, legislative, political, economical reforms, and so on. Basically, the goal is very simple. It can be formulated in two stages. Yeah, it's to create a potent state or potent economy from impotent economy, and then gradually to increase the potency of the economy in order to increase the well-being of the population, to create comfortable environment for businesses who are doing there, to create ample opportunities for the national government and for the local government to perform its functions, again, in the interest of the population and in the interest of the businesses, in order to integrate Ukraine within the network of the world economies and to put it on the economical map of the world and so on. So this will be something that we're going to keep discussing today. I would like to suggest that our honorable panelists, they will maybe take initial floors, and so they will explain their views on the subject matter of our today's panel, and then we will engage ourselves in a lively discussion on those topics. Thank you. Who would like to start? Francis, I'm basically eager to carry on.
As the host, maybe, and let me just say outright that this is my last panel. I'm not staying the whole day glued to this chair. You know, I'll actually be listening to the other ones afterwards. But no, when it comes to reforms, I think you're entirely right to frame it that way. Ukraine first of all, has done immense reforms in the past few years, clearly. Secondly, I think the best reforms are not ones that we say should be done. The best reforms are the ones that the Ukrainian people do for themselves. Because I'll be returning to London, I won't see the effect of the reforms that I've been pushing. and they wouldn't have gone very far unless there had been someone in Ukraine, be it the central bank governor, the Minister of Finance, some activists, I mean, business people that say, well, that makes sense for my country. And so for me, the question is more how we help Ukraine, because very often we actually have a dialogue with the new leaders that came after the Maidan around, I'd love to do that, but I don't have the capacity inside my administration. I don't know how to do it. Tell me how Kazakhstan did it. Tell me how Poland did it, and so on and so forth. And that's where I think we international financial institutions can bring the most value, is by actually providing examples, knowing full well that an example is just that. You can't replicate Poland into Ukraine. It's a different country, different culture, different. So you just say, okay, how about we take inspiration? And in that spirit, that's why we helped create the public administration reform support teams. Anton, who's here in the second row, is the leader of one of them, which was about taking stock of the fact that, again, a number of ministers were coming to us and say, hey, I need help, I need help, I need help. And that we realized that flying in consultants that were going to produce yet another strategy for that ministry was not going to be very helpful. And together with the EU, we partnered to actually create teams that are made up of Ukrainian people that are actually paid on a scale which is compatible with the future of the civil service of Ukraine, to create these skeleton crews, 10, 20, 30, depending on the ministries, but grand total is about 200, 300 people, that are actually going to then morph into the new civil service of Ukraine. And that's really an innovative approach that we've developed, and which I believe is bearing fruit by actually taking people into the civil service, not as consultants, but actually as executives. And the initial reaction was, on the one hand, great idea. On the other, we had conversations then with the Minister of Finance saying, oh, but I cannot find talent at the sort of prices that we are going to be able to pay. I need to be able to pay people market price for like Western European market prices. And then we said, well, look, Minister, whatever you feel you can afford going forward for your top civil servants is what you should be paying these people. And then there was some thinking, and then they came back and saying, yeah, it's going to be hard to attract good people, but let's go for that approach. And fact is, we've actually attracted, the government has actually managed to attract extraordinary talent to that program. Young people, transparent selection, anybody can apply. There's been appetite to join these teams, and these teams are doing a fantastic job. And so, that's, I think, an illustration of how IFI is getting together. We don't need to be all of us together all the time, right? On some issues, it's going to be the World Bank and the EBRD. On some others, it's going to be the IFC and the EBRD. On some others, EBRD is not involved at all. But getting together to work with the government of Ukraine has delivered results, and I think is one of the hallmarks of this country. Notwithstanding the comments that Bozida was making around, us pushing the country. Of course we push because we like what we see, but this IFI cooperation and this partnership with the government of Ukraine, I've been told by some foreign governments that this is unique in the world, and I think should be celebrated.
Thank you very much, Francis. Jason, IFC.
Actually, I think it would be a nice segue, maybe if Satu began.
Satu. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. That's right.
All right.
Satu, yeah. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So the World Bank is in Ukraine for the long haul, and our focus is the country's long-term development. And we have been very impressed by what Ukraine has managed to do in the past 4 years. We say often that Ukraine has done more in the past 4 years than in the first 2 decades of independence, and it's true. And when I took this job 2+ years ago, many people were telling me, that's impossible. Pension reform, impossible. Nationalization of private bank, that's impossible. Health reform, impossible. Education reform ain't gonna happen. Passing the legislation of the anti-corruption court, what do you think? Why are you supporting that? It ain't gonna happen. It ain't gonna come through, rather. But Ukraine has done that all. And I think here basically actions have spoken much louder than words. That what Ukraine has managed to do is really remarkable. And we on the World Bank side, we applaud Ukraine for that. But now moving forward, we also see that unfortunately, Ukraine cannot really afford to stop. And why Ukraine cannot afford to stop and why it needs to continue the reforms, there are actually three big reasons for that. The first big reason is that Ukraine still has not fully recovered from the 2014-2015 crisis. That crisis was so deep and the incomes dropped so much that even though Ukraine has now returned to growth, thanks to the reforms the government has very boldly taken, the per capita income levels are still below the 2014 levels, still below the levels where they were before the crisis. The second reason is that when we compare, and given that we are a global bank, global development institution, we do it all the time, we have to compare Ukraine to the other countries, in particular other countries in Eastern Europe. And unfortunately, Ukraine is still lagging behind. So the crisis of the latest crisis, 2014-2015, set also Ukraine back. And what our analysis shows is that basically Ukraine, if it doesn't accelerate economic growth, it's going to take at least 100 years for Ukraine to catch up with Poland. There was a lot of talk about Poland, and I completely agree. Poland's starting circumstances were very different from Ukraine. Poland has EU as an anchor. Ukraine doesn't have. So everything is much harder for Ukraine under the circumstances. So it takes at least 100 years to catch up with income levels in Poland. It takes 250 years to catch to levels of Germany if the growth remains at the current levels. So the growth challenge for Ukraine is enormous. And there were a lot of issues that were touched in the previous panels. The working age population is unfortunately declining. We see that throughout Europe. Basically, demographics is quite adverse for a lot of the countries, and Ukraine happens to be one. But we also have a lot of migration. I also hope that in 10 years' time, the people will return to Ukraine. But in the meantime, the working age population is shrinking, and we were shocked when we have been doing lately very significant analysis on growth, trying to understand what could be done to accelerate it, is that in fact capital stock is shrinking, and that's not good news. And then we see on the labor side, and that's why the education reform is so important, that there are big skills mismatches. So there are brilliant people in Ukraine, but not enough people who have right skills for the market. So we are bullish on Ukraine. Ukraine, I mean, people are talking about, oh, we are going to grow by 7% on a sustainable basis. No country in the world, or very few countries in the world, have ever managed to do that. But if Ukraine would continue with the reforms, it can achieve 4-5% growth per annum, and it can move to a very different place from where it is today. So what we would like to see is that the reforms would continue. Remarkable past 4 years. Let's continue on that path, and Ukraine is going to be then one of the shining stars because of geographical location, because of energetic and entrepreneurial people, because of huge agricultural land base that's there. Let me stop there, and then we talk later about the reforms.
Thank you, Satu. Jason, now we are just bouncing back to you. We, all of us, were quite aware about the ongoing saga about negotiations between the Ukrainian government and IFC about so on and so on. What's your view, and what do you think? What do you think about the next challenges, or the principal challenges that the Ukrainian government will be facing in its attempts to reform the country, and what should be done?
So thank you. First off, a thank you to Francis for the invitation as the host, and to Satu as well. The reason why I thought it was preferable to have Satu lead is the modus operandi between the World Bank and the IFC. The World Bank is taking the lead on the policy reform issues, and IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. We have significant portfolio in Ukraine. We've invested over $3 billion in the economy, and in the region, Ukraine is very much a priority country. It's a priority country for all the reasons that we've heard. The human resource, the agri-resource, the black soil. So there is tremendous potential, but I think there is also an understanding that a lot of this potential is unrealized, and hence why we're here talking about reforms. IFC, and I'm sure Francis feels similarly, that there's no reason why between us we couldn't be doing 2 times, 3 times what we're doing per annum. But in order to do that, we are going to need land reform. We are going to need further banking sector reforms. That being said, we have been successful nonetheless. Agri is about 50% of our portfolio, and we are doing major investments in agri-logistics. We are making investments in value-add agri. But again, I think the hope and the expectation is to increase that volume and to do significantly more in the agri space. In the banking sector, as I mentioned, NPLs are some of the highest in the world. We're at 55%, and the state-owned banks are dominating the sector. So IFC has been working together with the 4th largest state-owned bank, Ukrgazbank. Ukrgazbank is now a very successful case. 66% of all operating renewable megawatts are financed by Ukrgazbank. So we've helped green the bank. And we think that the green economy also has potential. I think we heard on some of the earlier panels that renewable energy is also one of the bright spots in the economy. It's been a bright spot by virtue of the feed-in tariff, which is actually quite high, and hence why investors have been very keen on coming into that space. It's my view that we need to move towards auction, which is the right thing for the country. But I can appreciate why investors have been very keen to come in based on the existing feed-in tariff. So I think by virtue of some of the good reforms and movement that has happened, IFC has been very successful in country and mobilizing private sector investment. Similar to what Francis had said earlier, most of our base is domestic investors. We're agnostic between domestic or international, but we do need more international investors. Net FDI last year was a little over $2 billion. And so that's about 2% of GDP. And that's to get from 3.5% to the 5-7% that we're discussing, where we are going to need strategic investors to come into the economy in a big way.
Thank you, Jason. Tanaka-san, I would like to pass the floor to you. The banking system is a blood system of the Ukraine of every country's economy. Yeah, we know all of the efforts of Mrs. Gontayeva, the former chairman of the National Bank of Ukraine, to clean it up. Almost 40% of non-sustainable commercial banks, they have been wiped away from the landscape of Ukrainian banking system. What's the current situation? Where do we go? And so on. I know that the National Bank of Ukraine has been praised by many international observers for its efforts in order to keep the national economy under the strict order. What are your views?
Yes. Well, I was asked by our Prime Minister to come over to Ukraine 2.5 years ago to address the non-performing loan problems, which is haunting the banking system of Ukraine, not only in the private banks, but also in the state-owned banks, which is much more in despair. And I come from the Bank of Japan, which is the central bank, but I am now, as the position says, I'm advising the Minister of Finance of Ukraine. But the restructuring of the banking system itself is very painstaking. We had the same problem in Japan. We revamped the system in Japan. I was in charge of that. So I'm trying to use my experience that we did in Japan, turning the non-performing loan problems so that Japan will develop more. But let me show you how the reforms are painstaking. I am now serving the third, finance minister. Now it's the acting finance minister in 2.5 years. I'm serving the third deputy minister in charge of the financial institution. I see the first one over there. This shows how, when you try to reform the banking system especially, there are lots of these interested parties on the other side. So it's going back and forth. But as far as I'm concerned, I am still in the office. I have been extended 1 year from the Japanese government to carry on. And in that sense, we are working very closely with EBRD, IFC, because we did the due diligence on the 3 state-owned banks that when I came in were the only state-owned banks that was there, which is the Oshad Bank, Ukreksin Bank, and Ukrekaz Bank. And of these 2, EBRD is now looking into the Oshad Bank, how they can help privatization. IFC is looking into the Ukrekaz Bank, how they can support the privatization. And as the Japanese government, we would like to support that as well. But we did a due diligence on the 3 state-owned banks with lots of obstacles that we had to overcome, but we finished it. We've provided the report this June. And so we know all the details of the 3 state-owned banks, which I cannot disclose here. But it is really in a devastated situation. And in that sense, I think it is the most unprecedented NPL country in the world, a world champion in non-performing loans, which we know the reasons why. And when we address the reasons, we get a lot of interventions from here and there and everywhere, from the top to the bottom. But we are going to continue that. IMF just requested to share the information we got, but of course we cannot do so. We can do on the large sort of indices that we got, but not on the customer base, because we have an NDA with the National Bank of Ukraine, as well as the procured consulting firms, which we cannot reveal the names of the customers because of the banking secrecy. We also had a probe from the SSU, or the SBU, that we should not look into the state secrets customers. And we dealt with the SSU, and they supported us as far as we don't look into the state secret customers. So we have a very detailed picture of how, or could, the state-owned banks especially can be reformed so that they can be, partially privatized on the good bank side. Who's going to take care of the bad bank side? These has to be addressed from now on, and that's why I have been, I don't know if 1 year is enough or not, but I'll be working on for another 1.5 years. And there's another reason why Japan, I'm the first officer from Japan in Ukraine, was because Ukraine sold the aircraft carrier to China, which China said was that they're going to use it for a overseas casino or something like that. But when it reached China, they rebuilt it into a real aircraft carrier. Now they have 3 copies of that. Now they have 4 aircraft carriers, which is a very big threat to Japan. And as you know, we have been experiencing a lot of rockets, ICBMs flying over Japan by North Korea. And the engines, the rocket engines, were developed in Ukraine. And I'm now supported by JICA, which is a state-owned policy bank in Japan. They are looking into building a bridge in Mykolaiv city, like the ones we have on the Istanbul Strait. But the news when that came out, China has bought all the lands on both sides where Japan is to put the suspension bridge. So, just before there was an announcement that the state-owned bank called the Ukrainian Bank for Development and Reconstruction was bought by the Chinese, and now they're building on it so that they can finance all this economic endeavors they are seeking in Ukraine, which is also a need for Japan to follow suit so that we will not be going on the tracks of China. There's a question from the floor that why don't Ukraine go to China for help? They're there, and that's the reason why I am put in Ukraine. They just bought the license of making Antonov 225, the largest aircraft in the world, which the G7 countries, led by Japan at that time, requested to the president that don't sell the Antonov 225 to China because it can be used for military purposes. They said they're going to use it for sending their spaceship into their space station, not using a rocket, but putting it on the Antonov 225 to the atmosphere, higher in the atmosphere, so that they can send it. But it can be used as a refueler aircraft, which is used for military purposes, which is also very dangerous to Japan. And all these things, we need to have Ukraine. The reasons why Ukraine have been doing that to China is because they need the money. And that's where the problem is. And in order to have Ukraine create its own money so that it can be independent and be developing on itself, of course, with help with the IFIs and maybe Japan, is that they need to reconstruct the banking system so that it is working. They can be financing whatever projects they think they should be doing, not relying on foreign aids. So that they can prosper on its own. But in order to do this, there has to be continuous reforms so that it can sort of convince the investors that have been talking here, that because investors, there are a lot of investors that have different aspects for risks that is involved, and of course the returns. And we have to be sure which investors should be having the sales of, for instance, the non-performing loans, so that they have an appetite or not. And if you don't be very restrictive on these investors who are seeking certain things, it might despair the whole reform that Ukraine is trying to seek. So from that part on, I think we need to have the investors of the world gather and divide them into what kind of risks they are wanting and the returns they are wanting, and place the, I'm talking about the non-performing loans, which will be sufficing their needs and will be helping Ukraine. And that is what I'm planning to do. It took 15 years for Japan to solve the non-performing loan problems. It would not be easy for Ukraine to solve their non-performing loan problems, but you have to start from somewhere. So that's where I am placed.
Tanaka-san, arigato. Yeah, thank you very much for this. I have perhaps an initial question to all members of our panel that relates to the thing that is called, nicknamed decentralization in Ukraine. As we all remember, since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukraine has fallen under very significant pressure from Russia to convert itself, or to implement constitutional reform in order to reformat itself into a very loose bunch of federal or better confederal entities, whatever, related by only very, 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 very loose economic or maybe even political, whatever, some links and so on. The Ukrainian government responded with, and it provided very firm response, no way, there will be no federation, but we will implement the so-called decentralization. And that decentralization is already en marche, yeah, for a number of years. And I can tell you frankly from my personal experience, 2 years ago, I, together with my family, we moved away from the city into a suburb, yeah. And these days, technically, I am a peasant, yeah. And my family, they are also peasants. Yeah, we live in a village close to Kyiv. It's not far away. It's if there's no traffic, it's like 35 minutes door to door from my house to my work and so on. And for these 2 years, I frankly was stunned myself. I was very pleasantly surprised because I saw with my eyes, traveling all through the countryside, and not only from my home to the office, but I simply love traveling through the Ukrainian countryside. I saw some very amazing transformations over there. I saw small, formerly dusted villages that seemed to be stuck somewhere in the 20s or 50s years of the former century, or the 20th century. They started to build up roads, streets, to pave them. They start building pavements, or using the language of our American friends, sidewalks for people to walk by the street, not through the streets themselves. Street lightings, cross lights, they were put in place. And for the avoidance of doubt, that's not a responsibility of Ukravtodor. Yeah, because Ukravtodor is responsible for everything that lays beyond the settlements, beyond the villages, beyond the cities. I am not sure whether this particular issue has been discussed extensively during the previous panels or not. What are your views about this particular reform? Is it an exemplary type of reform that must have been implemented in Ukraine, whether it has really indeed brought fruits to the Ukrainian population, the Ukrainian economy, or it's something that may seem slightly artificial, slightly or superficial? What do you think? That's a question to everybody.
Okay, why don't I then start decentralization? Decentralization is typically politically motivated when it's implemented in countries, and it's typically implemented in the guest to improve the service delivery. So the understanding is that, okay, if the local government officials who are closer to the people, they presumably know better what people want, and if they are given the resources, then they will also provide the services, and they are more accountable to the people. What we see the global experiences is that sometimes it works wonderfully, sometimes it doesn't. The devil is always in the details. It can complicate the macroeconomic management. I have worked on some countries where basically countries run into big macro problems. Central governments had big difficulties adjusting because they had very little control on local governments. So I see a really mixed picture, and I see also in Ukraine that in some oblasts, in some rayons, it's working very well. In some, not so. So it really depends then on the local leadership as well. Now, from the World Bank side, we are not heavily involved in decentralization. I know that there are a lot of other partners, EU above all, that is very vested in the decentralization process. From the point of view of growth acceleration, we don't think that this is the key reform, that there are other very, very big issues that are far more burning for Ukraine, and I hope that we will talk about those issues. One of them is indeed the NPL resolution, because if you have one factor of production, capital, that is not used efficiently, and as I said earlier, capital stock is shrinking right now in Ukraine, the NPL resolution is a really big priority moving forward. So that's what I would like to say about decentralization. It's a little bit of a mixed picture, but we have not focused on that very closely in the World Bank.
Jason, yeah?
So from where I sit, I think decentralization has been a success in Ukraine. And it was a reform born out of necessity. The central government could no longer afford the urban infrastructure projects necessary in the country, in the rural parts of the country. So I think there was a real business need to implement that reform. And now we see those mayors, and I agree with Satu completely, that it's very personality driven, where you have visionary mayors. So in the case of Mariupol, where we're working together with EBRD, you have a mayor who knows what he wants and how to achieve it, and he's been able to attract financing and advice from our institutions and implement a very robust urban infrastructure plan. I think we have the deputy mayor of Kyiv in here in the room as well, and we're also discussing with the city of Kyiv a number of urban sustainable infrastructure projects. Lviv mayor. So I think where there are plans, where there is a vision, and where there's an interest, decentralization has been effective, particularly in urban infrastructure, waste management, along with a few other infrastructure subsectors.
Thank you.
I fully agree with that. Well, first, to your question, I think, I mean, a country's constitutional arrangements should be a decision for that country. You know, whatever Italy thinks about the French constitution, we don't care, all right? So, you know, Ukraine is right to choose their own constitutional arrangements, and you can take any advice from anybody, but it is the decision of the Ukrainian people. Second thing is, I do think that decentralization works for accountability purposes, clearly. And the third thing is, just to go into where Jason was as well, it makes it possible for municipalities to finance themselves. Right? If a municipality does not have control of its own resources, then it cannot borrow, because you pay back the loan on the basis of the resources that you have. So it means that then we cannot lend to these municipalities to do projects with them. And we have to then resort to lending to the central government. Then there's a process of allocating of these resources to municipalities. And it can depend on many factors, you know, which mayor is in the same party as which minister, whatever, you know. It doesn't get into a business decision anymore, and we don't like to engage in that sort of projects because of the delays and the difficulties. And our model at EBRD is always to work as much as we can directly with the sub-sovereigns without a sovereign guarantee, unless the project is really too big, like the Kharkiv metro is too big for the funding capacity of the standalone municipality, and so it gets a sovereign guarantee. But having decentralization and fiscal decentralization enables the mayors to actually have a vision, but then also have a conversation with financiers like us around, okay, the vision is great, you've got 25 ideas, but how about what's the priority there? Which is the one that is going to deliver most for your city? And in Mariupol, you guys are financing tramways, and we're financing trolleybuses or something, right? So urban transport is very important. We're going to do other things in that city. We work together in other cities as well. But the urban landscape in Ukraine is such that, in fact, below a certain level, below the very top cities, there is no financeability of the projects. And I think the decentralization should contribute to the fact that going forward, if you go like 10 years, 5 or 10 years, it takes time to build this. You'll have more municipalities that will have a proper financial officer that will run a proper budget, and that will have projects that they have decided themselves for their own citizens, and where the mayor will be accountable for. Obviously, when there's corruption, and so if you have an area where the mayor controls the courts and the prosecutors and no names, but some cities in the south of Ukraine qualify for that, it makes it more difficult. It makes it even harder to reform. But on balance, I think it's been a really good thing.
If I may jump on that very quickly, because when I said that it's a mixed experience, because what exactly we see, cities like Kyiv, Lviv, Mariupol, basically places that have larger population, they're actually doing very well. But then we see small rayons that, in particular in the rural areas, that have primarily elderly people living there, they are actually struggling. And that's what we are now looking in particular in the social service delivery, how we can support them. So that's when I say it's mixed. It really depends on the leadership, but it also depends how big you happen to be as a rayon.
Can I just jump in on the NPL question as well? I wanted to, first of all, to commend the work. I think it's fantastic that Japan is helping on the financial sector. We've done the statistic that over the past 10 years, Ukraine has spent $15.5 billion propping up its state banks, right? Just for perspective, the current IMF program, which is coming to an end, was designed to be 17.5, out of which 8.5 have been disbursed. So Ukraine has spent essentially over the past 10 years twice the money that it received from the IMF to prop up its state banks. Why is that? Because repeatedly these banks have actually made lending decisions on the basis of this is good for the country. So that's an extension of the budget, right? You can't afford to put it in the budget, therefore, Oshad Bank is going to lend or Exim Bank is going to lend, and it ends in tears and losses, right? And so it's really important that we see corporate governance reform in the state-owned banks, privatization of the state-owned banks, because then, assuming you have good supervision and you don't have a repeat of the situation in the private banking sector in Ukraine where these banks are used as pocket banks by oligarchy groups, that problem has been dealt with now, hopefully in an irreversible manner. We have a strong central bank, but the problem of the state-owned banks, they're the majority of the assets in the banking sector right now, and unless their governance is fixed, I can predict with a high degree of confidence that we will be talking about the next banking crisis and the next need for recapitalization for these four banks in somewhere between 5 and 10 years, because it will continue. And that is critical that we can stop this. There's a high level of NPLs. I think, yes, we are the champions in the world. Excellent. 55%, I think, is the last number I saw. A lot of it is also, I mean, not to say that this is not a grave crisis and so on, but the percentage should also be taken into account with the fact that there's been very little lending over the past few years. So if you have a banking system that stops lending, which has been the case in Ukraine since 2014, essentially, then NPLs converge rapidly to 100%. Because those loans that are outstanding actually get reimbursed, and only the NPLs remain on the balance sheet. So the ratio of NPLs, which is very high, is also because there's no growth in the lending. If we see resumption in the lending growth, which will take some more reforms, especially around creditor rights, the ability to sell down NPLs, which is difficult in Ukraine. That's also why the NPLs stay on banks' balance sheets, because banks in the UK or in Western Europe manage to sell their NPLs. It's much more difficult to do in Ukraine. Then we should see a much healthier banking sector. And again, the central bank has made a tremendous job. I mean, they deserve all of the plaudits that they received and more for really having completely turned around that banking sector, which was a basket case of underperforming state banks and a lot of local privately owned banks which were used to essentially steal the deposits of the population. That's not the case anymore, and it's a major progress.
Thank you, Francis. Tanaka-san, would you like to add anything?
Yes, on the decentralization, which is not only regional decentralization, but also institutional decentralization is going on. And again, I don't want to make China a culprit, but I have been traveling throughout Ukraine, and when I went down to Odessa and to the Bessarabia region, there's a huge Chinese complex, more than 30,000 or something like that, in a whole apartment houses, which operate the sort of shopping center nearby. And there, the traders are Chinese, the vendors are the foreign exchange people are the Vietnamese. It's a huge population. You won't believe you're in Ukraine, and that's why I think the Chinese went there, and then they said that we will be investing here. The regional government needs the money, so that they accept it, I guess, but didn't think that there'll be more and more people coming in, and it's growing and growing. And these we can also see near Lviv, where China is seeking to be the outlet on their new Silk Road to Europe. Also in the Danube River trade, they have provided 50 vessels so that they can totally control the shipment into mainland Europe. And these are all based on the decentralized sort of decision by the regional government. I don't know if the central government is catching on what it's being done. And this, very recently, we have the Japan-Ukrainian Center in the Kyiv Polytechnic University's library, which is quite popular. I think 2 months ago, when I visited there, there's a huge Confucius statue in front of the library saying that we're checking you, Japan, don't follow us like what you've been doing. And when I passed by, the students all tried to take a picture of me with Confucius, thinking that I'm Chinese. So, no, I'm Japanese. Don't take a picture of the Confucius, but go into the library, because we have a lot of things there that can be provided. And this, again, it was the KPI, which did need some assistance from the foreign countries. We have been providing a lot of assistance, but the Chinese are there to provide more so that they can get the technology that KPI is good for, so that it will be enhancing their, well, I hope not, it's not the military, but their technological procedures. Mm-hmm.
I see that we are running out of time. I will ask yet one additional question to the panel, and then I will open floor to the questions from. Sorry, I'll pass the floor to you to state the questions from the audience. The painful subject, very painful subject, and I will not talk about the gas tariffs, the land. Yeah, the land. When you travel westbound from Kyiv, yeah, you sit in the window seat, you can easily trace the boundary between Ukraine and Poland, yeah, because when you look downwards, yeah, you will see the huge plains, huge fields in Ukraine and so on, and then right after the boundary, you see small parcels and so on, very, very, very small parcelization of agricultural land in Poland and so on. And Satu, that comes to your observation that about the starting position, comparative positions between Ukraine and Poland, especially if we will take the cutoff date of 1991, for example, we will see that perhaps the starting positions of Poland from economic perspective, they were much worse than for Ukraine at the time, because Ukraine was praised at the time as like the leading economy of the post-Soviet world. Yet we have a quite completely different result these days. Yeah, but at least for me, one of the explanations that I can find for myself is that the communist power in Poland has never managed to destroy the private ownership of land. Only 15% of the land was so-called collectivized. 85% remained in private hands. And agricultural lands, arable lands, and perhaps Ukraine has almost the best lands, quality of lands, soils in the world. They are capital, and they are unused capital. this capital sits idle. Yeah. To add a spice to add spice to our discussion, we have a very interesting development recently. We have European Court of Human Rights, and under a complaint of a Ukrainian citizen, a European Court of Human Rights has taken a precedent decision, judgment, that this moratorium on privatization of agricultural lands that is going on rolling basis in Ukraine for many, many, many years already, it's a violation of human rights, and it should be deemed illegal. Under Ukrainian legislation, the decisions of European Court of Human Rights, they have the status of precedence. They must be followed by all of the courts in Ukraine, and right now the Ukrainian judiciary, as well as Ukrainian legislature, and executive branch as well, they are stuck with this particular situation. That it's not only an economic pressure any longer, but it's a legal pressure as well. What are your views in this, on this subject matter? What's wrong, what's right, where to go, how to implement?
Thank you for the question. Those who follow Ukraine probably hear us in the World Bank talking a lot about the land reform, and we don't talk about it because we think, okay, it's just one reform among others, but we talk because it's so important. It's the single most transformative reform that Ukraine could undertake to accelerate growth. I mean, in all the analysis that we do, we see that this is the area where in the foreseeable future the growth will come to Ukraine. The agricultural potential is so huge. But then when you look at the yields today, they are very low. They are a fraction of the neighboring countries. And the lease rates, 7 million people who are renting their land at the moment, they are a fraction. They're $37 on average per hectare, when all the neighboring countries, they are, very big. And this is really the most fertile land in the world. So something is going fundamentally wrong. And obviously there are a number of reasons why the agriculture is not reaching its potential. There are logistical constraints that we are now working with the government to address those. But the single biggest issue that keeps on coming when we talk to the investors, we do surveys and we do analysis, is land. When you don't use your biggest factor of production after people efficiently, things are going wrong. So about the state land is right now subject to heavy corruption, heavy misuse, and that is something that would need to be addressed. The land is in private hands. 80% of the land is in private hands. And I keep on asking people, would you be fine if you own real estate and you wouldn't be allowed to sell and buy real estate? And they say, absolutely no. Land, it's the same thing. It's the same kind of a private good. That opening up the land market would be very beneficial. Now, I do want to go back to what, because Bozidar was very provocative in the previous panel. And he was saying, oh, no, why people are pushing for the opening of the land market, why are they not pushing for land leases? Land leases already exist. If you just extended the leases, you would basically entrench the status quo even more. So I said earlier, there are 7 million landholders, and the stories that I'm hearing, how they are, I'm sorry to use the word, but they are cheated into the contracts. Sometimes they don't even know that what has happened in the registry and cadastre and what has happened to their land. It's quite criminal. So basically, that would need to be broken up. Also, what I hear now from the private sector side, me and my colleagues are hearing, is that also the uncertainty is killing the private sector and the agribusiness, because you don't know what's going to happen to the moratorium from 1 year to the next, and therefore the investments are not coming in. Francis mentioned in the previous panel irrigation. We know that there are a lot of private investors just waiting to come to irrigation. So for us, we on the World Bank side, we are now looking at and saying, okay, let's try to help the authorities to get through the enabling environment, the legislative framework, the right regulations and policies for people to come into irrigation. But as long as land is closed, those investors will not come. So basically just opening the land market is going to be critical. Yes, I know there's a fear of oligarchs, there's a fear of foreigners that would come, but what the government is deciding how they want, when and how they want to open the market. But what they have been planning, we have been helping them on the technical side to think how to through it and put in place the prerequisites. That they're planning to put in a lot of safeguards that would help to safeguard so that the small farmers, small agribusinesses, medium-sized farmers, medium-sized agribusinesses would also flourish.
Any other views, Tanaka-san?
There is a state-owned institution that is doing a very good job in lending to farmers, as well as the SMEs in Ukraine, and that is the German-Ukrainian Fund, which is capitalized by KfW of Germany and the Ministry of Finance, and MBU, which is now tucked under the Ministry of Finance. When checking their performance, they have been doing what we call the two-step loan from JICA to other borrowers in other countries. The German government has been helping that. And their NPLs are just like any good country that has overcome the NPL problems. It's only about 2% or even less. And most of their customers are, as I said, very small farmers as well as SMEs. And this shows that if the things are done like credit scoring or how they can get the collaterals, which are not land but rather movable collaterals, which they can only afford. These can be implemented so that they can pay back. And looking into those, the financial sort of activities of the smaller sort of institutions and also non-bank financial institutions, they're doing quite fine. And the problem still lies in the large enterprises. And most of the non-performing loans in Ukraine are not state-owned enterprises. They're all private enterprises, most of them, which shows that it highlights the problems Ukraine has. And if it is done properly, by the regulators or by the owners of these state-owned banks and the state-owned enterprise reforms as well, Ukraine has a potential of getting into a real functioning banking system. So that I would like to show as an example that we are at the government of Japan trying to support the German-Ukrainian Fund. We'll be having a delegation going to Japan next month so that we can start from the good side of the banking system in order to enhance that, so that at the same time trying to help resolve the non-performing loans of the larger quantity side.
Thank you, Tanaka-san. I would like to open the floor to the audience. Please introduce yourself and use the microphone.
Yeah, hi, Adrian Karatniski. I want to return to one of the mechanisms that the international community and international financial institutions have been focused on, and that is the issue of corruption. I think that we've heard that there has been reasonable progress in eliminating corruption flows through the reforms that occurred in Naftahaz, through things like Prozoro, through things like eliminating tax holes, or at least partially eliminating them, through some of the tighter enforcement of what used to be called zombie banks, etc. One study, which was Western refereed and done by Ukrainian economists, estimated that annually it was like $6 billion in corruption reduction that has occurred. And of course there are many other areas that have not been treated in this same way, and there's a lot of corruption at all levels. But the international community has been, almost, and international financial institutions, focused on a punitive system of corruption. And I'm just wondering whether that is the most effective way, because the record of punitive corruption campaigns is very, very mixed. Francis Fukuyama has a study that says basically it doesn't work. The 11-year experience of Romania is of a lot of political chaos and politically tendentious prosecution by the parties in power against the parties outside of power. I know that there are all sorts of efforts made to try to correct this by having Western refereed and NGO refereed processes, but you know, we have problems with the special anti-corruption prosecutor. We don't really know whether NABU will be the most effective and neutral institution. It seems to be doing some things that are disruptive of the government by going after, you know, underreporting of income without any necessarily evidence of corruption and relatively minor amounts of money. So I think that the international system has, the international emphasis on punitive attacks on corruption will create a lot of instability in the politics and reform process of Ukraine, and opens the door to, I would say, terrible manipulation. So I want to just hear the responses of the panel. Why is there not more of an emphasis in simply reducing corruption flows, but this, you know, this inveterate insistence on creating a very intrusive and wide-ranging effort of rooting out and then punishing past corruption?
Any volunteers? Yeah, Satu.
I can start, and I'm sure that my colleagues then also will chime in. But I think your characterization of what we are doing, that we single-mindedly focus on punitive measures, is actually not accurate. If you would look at what, for example, the World Bank is doing, the issue of good governance, the issue of trying to reduce leakage and address corruption is actually running through everything what we do. So bulk what we do, I mean, we can talk about, you know, the land reform is also an issue of let's promote good governance. Let's basically bring the transparency and let's try to cut the corruption. Healthcare reform, there is some significant corruption in the healthcare sector. And I could go on and on. Pretty much everything what we do, we are very much looking at the governance angle. So slowly, some of the holes, what we call a Swiss cheese, some of these holes in the Swiss cheese are getting smaller. In some cases, they are getting plugged, but the holes are still there. Now, in Ukraine, I mean, we are very pleased that the Ukraine has launched the judicial reform. But when you're in a situation where the courts are not delivering justice all the time, you really then need to have also a mechanism that would demonstrate to the people that the authorities are serious. And the biggest corruption cases, the people are also facing the prosecution. And for that reason, I mean, we are focusing on the anti-corruption court. We don't recommend it lightly, but in the case of Ukraine, we don't see any other way. Because, you know, closing the Swiss cheeses, it's going to take a lot of time. But the corruption concerns are so big. A lot of investors are coming to talk to us. And the number one concern, what we hear from the people is, first of all, corruption. The number one concern that we hear also from investors links to the governance. Links basically to the rule of law and links to corruption. So
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Why is there no emphasis then on adjudicating property rights and settlement of why is there no not as much of a focus on an independent, Sviatoslav Vakarchuk in a recent article and speech suggested that one of the things that should be done is the creation of perhaps a group of Western judges who could be brought in to adjudicate and deal with contract disputes and so on, and therefore to do what, in a sense, Kazakhstan has done. He wasn't using the Kazakhstan model, but sort of a similar idea, that you bring in people of repute from Western judicial institutions for a temporary period and allow them to adjudicate. That, it seems to me, would have a huge effect in raising investor confidence. The idea of punishing the vast array of dodgy and questionable transactions in Ukraine's past history will only create economic uncertainty. So my question to you is creating greater uncertainty about who owns what property or what scandal may involve a large company or another company, is the best way to attract investment? Or is it better to move forward with mechanisms that reduce the scope? And yes, the Ukrainian people do want blood for past crimes, but that may not be. I'm asking from an economic utilitarian effect. Is that the most effective way? We may have a more just society, but it may not be necessarily a more growing and attractive society for investment.
Best for the economy, I agree. I'm sorry, but what planet are you from? I mean, excuse me, people in Ukraine want justice. And you're not going to be able to stop the flows of corrupt money unless there is an enforcement. What you have in Ukraine is no enforcement. Okay? So, no, but sorry, I mean, you asked a very long question, so let me please have a short answer. You have a situation in Ukraine where the justice doesn't work, where you can be an entrepreneur and someone forges a document, forges your papers, forges your signature, and says, he owes me 10 million. So are you suggesting we don't fix that? All right, so it needs to be fixed, right? It needs to be fixed. I cannot see a situation where someone is an exporter, has a VAT receipt, gets into the tax administration, and then is said, no, sorry, we cannot pay you, and within a few days gets a call saying, hey, by the way, in exchange for a 35% fee, you get to the top of the pile. And then goes to the prosecutor general in that oblast, who declines to investigate. Goes to the SBU in that oblast, who declines to investigate. Why do you think that is? Right? So unless you fix that, you're never going to have a stop to these things. Now, of course, you don't need only to be punitive, and I don't think any of what we do is only punitive. You do need to have an electronic payment system for VAT, which has been put in place. With whose money and whose support? IFIs? No, we've not done this at all, right? Well, who do you think paid for Prozoro? The punitive guys, right? the EBRD paid for Prozoro. So I don't think, we don't focus only on punitive, but what we see, though, is that there's probably a little bit more push that's needed on fixing the punitive in Ukraine. So you hear us be a bit more vocal, because that's where the push needs to be.
Just real briefly on some of the themes that were just addressed by my colleagues. I think the promoting good governance is something that's coming both from the government and from the private sector. And so I think in this room, a good case study is Ukrzheliznytsia, right, which is a good source of a history of leakage, shall we say. But now we have an independent board which should have a good role in setting procedures and policies that will help clean up. And this isn't just Ukrzheliznytsia, but this is a number of state-owned enterprises. Another case in point is Ukrgazbank, which voluntarily went to a 5 independent versus two state representatives. So, and on the private sector, we have what's called a corporate governance advisory practice, which originated in Kyiv and has now gone global. So corporate governance is something that is core to everything that IFC is doing in country, and I think, as Satu mentioned, is core to the World Bank program as well.
Thank you so much. I suggest that we take one more question. I see Dan Billock, he's the chairman of Ukrinvest. Yeah, he'd like to.
Thank you very much, Daniel Bilek, Ukraine Invest, and Vice Chairman of Ukrzheliznytsia Supervisory Board. I think that we may be talking around, broadly, we all agree on the same things. I mean, I'm as frustrated as anybody. I have my own list of people I'd like to see go to jail. And unfortunately, they're not there yet. We have managed, in the course of assisting investors over the last 2 years, to remove the heads of a number of agencies who nominally report to the government, but actually are there reporting to and financial streams that go into people either in parliament or in other institutions. And so all of the things that you're describing are still problems, but they are a declining issue, and it's a declining problem. And we see this from the feedback that we get from investors. One very important issue, and it when we talk about corruption, it's much easier to paint with a roller than a paintbrush, because you can make broad sweeping statements that everybody believes because this been fed into this echo chamber for the last 2 years. And one thing that we've sort of missed is left Hamlet out of the play on is the court system. At the end of the day, what we're talking about here is property rights. If we do not have a secure system of property rights for investors, this will always be highly problematic, to put it mildly. And I really think that we need, and I really would encourage the IFIs to get behind this, because for some reason I can't get the Council of Europe and the EU, who have been providing adult supervision to the process of selecting the new Supreme Court. I think we really need to do an evaluation of the decisions that have been taken by the new Supreme Court from January of this year in both the commercial chamber and the administrative chamber. What we are getting as responses from both Ukrainian and from foreign investor business is that things have significantly improved. For me, the litmus test was Sanofi. And when I was asked by people inside the government, you got to get behind the new court reform and promote this. And I said, okay. I mean, as a lawyer, I've been involved in this for many, many years. For me, this case is absolutely critical, because this was a case of absolutely clear case of fraud. We worked very hard in government for the lower court decisions not to actually get implemented by the bailiff service, by the state execution agency. And I said that when it comes to cassation, for me, this will be the litmus test of whether or not we actually have any hope of judicial reform. When I read the case, when I read the judge's decision, I cried for joy, for a change, because it was beautifully written. It slapped down the appeal court and the court of first instance by saying it was completely unacceptable that independent expertise of documents that were forged was not allowed in as evidence in the court. And uniquely, without getting overly technical, but this is really important, the judge applied Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Article 6 is the right to a fair trial. Most EU states do not apply Article 6 to commercial cases. They apply them only to criminal cases, and in some cases, administrative law cases. So this is actually a success story. It's one, okay, but there are others that haven't had quite the resonance. Even the French ambassador tweeted that they were happy. This was like really, that shows how unique it was. And the fact that this is actually, and I'm hearing this from advocates that are going to courts, this is a good sign. You don't overhaul a court system in a year or 2 years. But as our friend from China was saying, I don't know if you're from China, but you're our friend from China. It is remarkable how much has happened. We are only building institutions in this country for 4 years, and this is why it's so important to have the robust support of the people on the stage, and to stay the course, especially when it comes to the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. The DCFTA is arguably, and the EU Association Agreement is arguably the most important thing that has happened in this country since independence, because it assures us of getting into regulatory compliance and filling our new institutions that we're only building now with the content that actually binds us into the European Union. So property rights forever, Ukraine now.
You wanted a short question?
May I suggest one final question? May I suggest one final question, because we have already eaten up time of this next panel. And
so that's a quick question. It's up to you with the answer. So Robert Miles, Immerser, and now Immerser Ukraine as well. So on what was said earlier, we have been looking at the market and the opportunity over there. And we did. We went over, we visited. We were overwhelmed with the reception that we had. We spent time with commerce, we spent time with government ministers, and we really saw what was there. And as such, we have incorporated an entity that is with local partners. Now that's around the energy industry. We've been looking at the gas and solar being the predominant of the renewable. Coming back to, there was a mention of Silk Road, Chinese investment coming in, which we all know is to promote the sale of their own international export. Is there not really a crying out when we look at obviously the FIT tariffs that are coming in that are very attractive? Is there not a cry out which we're looking at is further internal investment to grow production and manufacturing facilities within the Ukraine through foreign investment and support, which would then help boost the economic recovery, increase commerce, and through that own sustainability? And should we not be looking at maybe how we can assist them through international investment and debt, which would then go further to help us with, you know, underperforming loans through that internal? And is there much consideration around that? Because we'd love to have conversations with anybody that would be looking down that road.
No.
Yeah. So the short answer to that question is that yes, I mean, Ukraine does need to build up its manufacturing sector. That will be a key driver for the economy. There's right now Ukrplastic I saw earlier here today, that's an example of plastic manufacturing. They've gone and they're now exporting into Europe in addition to catering to their own market. In addition to that, we have automotive manufacturing in the western part of the country, and so that I think has gone from a $20 million business to $1.2 billion over the past 7 or 8 years, and a lot of that is coming from the Japanese. So I think but how do we scale that up and introduce that to other areas of the economy?
Just to say quickly, come to us.
Can I just add one tiny bit to that? Just one tiny bit to that. I mean, what we've seen through renewables, I mean, we've worked throughout Europe for the last decade, and we see this solar coaster, where we see this massive international investment to promote export into that country, into that region, and then it's completely deployed, and then these investors leave again. Whereas if we were to consider a more systematic deployment of that through internal resources, then there could be a built sustainable entity rather than everyone spending 2 billion, 3 billion euros over the next 2 years to take advantage of these high fits, and then it all be gone and back in the state where the Ukraine are paying these fits to external investors, and there isn't that recycling of internal money.
You know, that's I mean, it's a long debate about the feed-in tariffs, about the auctions, about, come and talk to us. We invest, we're the largest investors, the IFC. We work on the regulation with the World Bank. So let's have a conversation around it.
And it's exactly the issue, you know, how to bring foreign direct investment to Ukraine that we are now also focusing. Because it's only right now 2.1% of GDP. It's extremely low, and it has not bounced back yet. And that for Ukraine to grow, we need that. So we are basically all for that, and we think that there is quite a bit that the government could do to facilitate that and to keep the investors who are coming in also in country and happy.
We've got 600 megawatts solar to start with.
I suggest that we discuss this issue in the course of the next panel as well. And do we have a coffee break right now? No. Yeah, unfortunately, no coffee break for all of us. Let me thank you, the distinguished members of our panel, for your insight into the problems. It was very useful, I guess, for our audience. Let's give a round of applause here.